So this is to remind you of what I talked about in November, for those that were here. Who was here in November when I talked about, okay, awesome. So that's me working on one of the radios there at the museum, getting it all. Believe it or not, you can still follow the 1941 manual for some of these radios and align them and get them tuned and tweaked up to operate. And this one here is actually now
original radio in that airplane?
not for that particular airplane, but it is original for that. Yep, sure is. And there's a picture of me. They forced me to put that stuff on and sit at the radio operator's compartment there. But man, I tell you, you guys know some of the folks that have been involved at the museum down there. Just great people. Jen Grismer and Jerry McLaughlin and that whole crowd. I still stay in touch with them and visit Savannah fairly regularly. Not as often as I did when I had a daughter at Georgia Southern, but we get down there quite a bit still. So as a reminder, and for those who didn't meet me the first time, Guy McDonald, I'm kind of an IT nerd. I'm in that game after I left the service. It was a natural progression for me to get into. We really didn't have networks like Jeff and I know today. It was precursory stuff, but over the years I was able to learn some things. And I live here in the metro. I'm up in Ackworth, if anybody knows the Bentwater golf course up there. That's where we're at now. Like Brent said, I have a small, kind of a fledgling service organization, and I do a sort of very, very amateur weekly live stream. I'll talk more about that later. I am an amateur radio operator. Any fellow hams here? Or anybody know a ham?
Do they call you Sparks?
I've been called a Spark is one of the many things I've been called, yeah. Spark. Some of them are less flattering than others, but and then I am actually considered the chief radio operator for the B-17 City of Savannah, which is an honor to be called that. And we do. I was just telling, is it Bill, right? I was telling Bill, periodically we'll crank up the radio station. We cleverly hid a ham radio station inside the compartment, and we'll crank up the radio station for special occasions, and we'll just talk to the world from the B-17 and tell the story of the museum and the restoration and stuff. It's a lot of fun. Don't get to do that as much as I did when I was living there, but we do make a point. In fact, we'll be down there next weekend. Like Brent said, I met my lovely wife in the Air Force, and you can see we're going to talk a little bit more about my family legacy as we get through to the end. Brent knows.
Not a picture of her, is it?
No, thank God, right? Yeah, I wouldn't have married her. But together, believe it or not, we have 12 grandkids, two brand new ones. They're twins, but and they're kind of scattered hither and yon. But and then of course my other vehicle is the B-17. Okay, so what we're going to talk? Wow, I just got like the voice of God here. Okay, good. So I want to tell this story about this mission that I was involved in for just 11 years of my life, right? Probably the most formative in my life. And I don't really consider that period of time really as anything extraordinary or remarkable on my part, especially compared to like my father, who's a Vietnam vet, and a son of mine that's a Operation Iraqi Freedom vet. But I do love to tell the story about the mission I was involved in and the men and women I served with. I like to talk. I'm going to try to get us out of here by lunch tomorrow. If I'm able to, I could talk about stuff like this all day long. But when, like Brent said, when I was talking last time, to add a little bit of color and context to why would this guy be involved with a B-17 and radios and aviation and things like that, I had to sort of tell a little bit about my story, which includes my time in the Air Force as a part of this mission. Now, like many of you, the older I get, the more I look back and romanticize on those times, right? When you're in your 20s in the moment, it's right now. You're really not thinking about so much the broader context of what you're actually involved in. When I look back on it, I think, wow, they let me do that, right? They trusted me with that.
You were only 20.
And I was 20 years old, right? I was 18 to almost 30 was my window, right? Very stupid and impressionable and all of that stuff, but we made it work. We did it. I mean, that was the crew complement, right, in that range. So let me tell you a little bit about that mission. I love to talk about it, and then I'll move in a little bit more specifically about my role on the mission. So has anybody heard of some terminology you might hear, Worldwide Airborne Command Post, or Post-Attack Command Control System, or Looking Glass? Has anybody heard in your lifetime about, okay. Looking Glass, okay. Good, that's good. So that's good. That'll give us a kind of a running start on some of this. But early in the 60s, you know, the Cold War was cranking up in the late 50s and into the 60s, and you know, the Russians were really cranking up their nuclear intercontinental ballistic missile capabilities, etc. And you know, we were going back and forth, right? Bigger missiles, better missiles, longer missiles, all that stuff. And somewhere along the way, somebody in the Pentagon said, well, if Washington, D.C. gets hit, what are we going to do? Or if the SAC underground command post at Offutt Air Force Base gets hit, what do we do? Right? So they started thinking about making backup systems for that eventuality, especially as the flight time from launch to impact continued to shorten, right? How do we, you almost conceded that certain places there was no way you were going to get away quick enough. It's just the flight time had gotten too short, right? So what do you do to combat that? Well, you build other locations that can back up this location, and those are targeted now, right? So, well, how about the idea of having the same command control capability but making it mobile, right? In fact, making it airborne. So the concept came up to make the capability of command and control of the nuclear forces, that nuclear triad that Brent mentioned. Anybody know what the triad consists of?
Submarines, ballistic missiles, and airplanes.
Airplanes largely of what type?
Bombers.
The B-52, pretty much, yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's the nuclear triad, right? So
it's the B-52, submarines, and missile sites?
Intercontinental ballistic missile, so early on Titan, then Minuteman, Peacekeeper.
So I'm in the cheap seats up here, okay?
Yep, okay. Yeah, so that's the nuclear triad. So, so the thinking was, okay, you've almost conceded that you can't prevent the Russians from launching. There's no preventive mechanism. You can't probably intercept them, right? That idea came a little bit later with Star Wars and other things, right? I mean, Star Wars by Reagan, right? Not Star Wars, George Lucas. But so the idea was that we needed to be more survivable. So, assuming that those initial strikes occurred, what are we going to do about it, right? Well, we're going to retaliate, right? It's too late to do anything about what just happened, but we can put ourselves in a position to recover, right, with some redundancy and some backup. So this whole concept of an airborne command post that would mirror the SAC underground command post, hence the term looking glass, another term for mirror. So that's the connotation for the name of the mission, is that they would take the capability that existed in the underground command post, knowing that it was going to be annihilated along with all of our families in the local area. How would we continue to respond and retaliate, right? And that became the Looking Glass mission. And a fairly new aircraft in the inventory was tapped to provide that mission, and that was the KC-135. There's a KC-135 crew chief here somewhere, right here. Yeah, so the KC-135, which was still fairly new, late 50s, some early 60s, it was tapped to be the platform to fly this mirrored command post. So the mission began February 3rd, 1961. And all of us that were involved in that community every February 3rd. We recognize that and herald it and all that stuff. It was a very one of the things. It's not just the time that makes it important, but the fact that there was a looking glass aircraft airborne at all times for almost 30 years. Every single hour of every single day of every single year, there was an aircraft airborne to perform that mission. Not only, and I'll talk about the crew complement, but not only did it mirror the underground command post capabilities from a command control perspective and all the necessary communications capabilities, but we also every mission carried a general officer. And that general officer could be a commanding officer from some base all throughout the States, right? And he would fly into Offutt and do a duty of flying on the glass for a couple of days, and then he'd go back and do his regular job, and they would cycle in and out. And does anybody know what the role of that general officer was called very specifically? It was the AEAO, Airborne Emergency Actions Officer. So every mission had this general officer on board. It was an Air Force officer. This is all the way up to 9. I'll talk about the later years, but this is during the time that I was involved. Now, I wasn't involved in 61 because I was 2 years from being born, but I got involved in 81, so 20 years later I got involved in the mission, and it hadn't really changed a whole lot by then. In fact, I was working on communications equipment that was original, 60s type stuff, and then of course as time goes on things become upgraded and modified and increased capabilities, etc. So continuous airborne alert, that makes it pretty incredible. You guys that are pilots understand maintenance, you understand life cycles of airframes, you understand all of that stuff. To be able to fly continuously for 30 years is quite a feat, and I'll talk about some of the things that come into play to allow that to happen successfully. And not only was the looking glass mission, not only did the looking glass component of the mission exist, but if you go to the broader Worldwide Airborne Command Post Network, we had squadrons positioned in different geographies to sort of build this communications network, and I'll show you a map of that here in a minute. So some of the other names that some of you guys that have served may recognize in addition to Looking Glass would be Silk Purse, Scope Light, Blue Eagle. Silk Purse was the mission I flew out of RAF Mildenhall. Scope Light was out of Langley Air Force Base, and Blue Eagle was out of Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii. And generally speaking, all of those locations would have an alternate base that we could go to in the event of weather or runway, repair or anything like that. In the case of Silk Purse, we had a forward operating base that we used, that we kept one aircraft on continual alert, ground alert, at Lodges Field in the Azores. Anybody know Lodges? Navy guy probably knows Lodges. About 1,000 miles off the coast of Portugal in the North Atlantic. An archipelago of islands belong to Portugal. But the thinking in that case for Silk Purse is we were based in England. We were too close to two things: the incoming assault into Central Europe from the Soviets, and the threat from Soviet nuclear-armed submarines. So they decided to just move us a little bit out of the way, gave us a little more of a fighting chance to scramble and get off the ground before the Azores disappeared. So that was, a lot of things like that. The same with the Blue Eagle. They were in Hawaii, but they could also pull alert in Korea or March Air Force Base in California. So we had some satellite bases that we could operate out of. Scope Light out of Langley. And then we had, and the map will help you with this in a minute, but we had some other bases that were northern tier bases where we would pull satellite alerts or have radio relay aircraft that could extend our communications reach in Minot and Grissom, and somebody was an Ellsworth guy here. We had my crew chief at Ellsworth. We had an operation out of Ellsworth. So I mentioned the whole post-attack command control. One other unique thing, I have some pictures of this that our platform could do to enhance our ability to respond, retaliate, and survive, was the fact that we possessed an airborne launch control system, so ALCS, and again, in using the looking glass terminology, the mirroring terminology, we could actually communicate with a missile silo via radio signals, and we could communicate with a warhead of a particular missile in a particular patch to execute a launch from the aircraft. And we did that over radio waves and some other archaic technology. And so our nuclear launch capability was interesting at the time, because it wasn't all computerized, like we would think today. There's Mylar tape where that enters data into a primitive CPU. There's a lot of moving parts, electromechanical kind of components, and it's made it kind of fun. But we could retaliate in that capacity. Let's say the missile field, if their launch control officers were decapitated, but the missiles were still in their silos, we could launch those missiles from the aircraft.
Without any assistance from the ground? Without any assistance from the ground,
yeah. Wow. And in fact, we carried 2 missileers on board as part of the crew, and we had the same sort of 2-key turn, right, that you see in the missile silos. Has anybody visited a missile silo? So you've seen some of there's a reason for the separation of the 2 keys, right? So one person can't, it's always 2-man control. Well, in the aircraft, we maintain the same thing. So the keys to turn to launch the missiles out of the silo were separated by a particular minimum distance and all those things. So yeah.
Does your EC-35 just have certain silos, or can it launch any silo in the United States?
From a technology perspective, it was more procedural that would dictate which you launched and where and how and all of that stuff.
Fascinating.
So yeah, so that's a unique capability.
One thing I never knew was, did the Russians, did they have an equivalent program?
Well, when I was, the years that I was in here, we didn't think they did, and I never heard anything about it. Although I read a lot, and I've seen, in fact, pictures of their airborne command post, but I don't know that they ever developed the airborne launch control system capability or not. Yes, sir.
Were you coordinated with Chrome Dome?
Well, Chrome Dome. Yes, so Chrome Dome, that's is that the continuous airborne alert of the B-52s?
Yeah, B-52s,
yeah. So that comes from the same posture that drove our continuous airborne alert. And then for those of you that don't know about Chrome Dome and other programs, we would have nuclear-armed B-52s on continuous airborne alert. And they would do the same thing. They would rotate, they'd go fly they'd be airborne for 6 or 8 or 10 hours or whatever. Another one would come up and assume the orbit, and they'd go back and land. And I think over time that became, it's costly, first of all, but it became a little bit dangerous. Does anybody know there's a hydrogen bomb off the coast of Tybee? Yeah. It wasn't from a B-52, but the same, and we dropped one in Spain, and so the risk, so here's the expert right here on that, what was it, Broken Arrow?
Something like that.
Bent Spear, Broken Arrow, the escalation of that nuclear incidents. But yeah, good call out on that increased posture of continuous airborne alert applied also to the B-52s for a period of time. I don't know when that stood down, but all right. The other thing unique about the platform is the submarines being one part of the triad, one of the ways we were going to retaliate, right? We needed to be able to communicate with them no matter where they were, no matter how deep they were. Now, if anybody's an RF person or know about radio and radio properties and stuff like that, radio waves have limitations based on their frequency, right? How far they'll travel, what they'll penetrate, and that the wavelength of a signal generally dictates those sort of things. Well, in the case of a submarine that's at the bottom of the ocean, how do you get a signal through there to send them a message to launch their payload? Well, one of the ways, they have other ways. They have SATCOM and all that stuff too, but one way that was very survivable was to use LF, VLF frequency spectrum. That's low frequency, very low frequencies. So the lower the frequency, the longer the wavelength. Well, the properties of this long wavelength allow it to penetrate the ocean so that the signal can get down to the submarine and they can receive the order to launch, right? So it was a unique capability. In order to do that, well, maybe let me hold off because I have some pictures of that. But if I don't explain it when I get to the pictures, Jeff's going to tell me to. So a little more on the timeline. The continuous airborne operation of the Looking Glass ended, and I was there when it happened, on July 24th of 1990. All of a sudden, we were so accustomed to flying 3 missions a day, 8-hour missions. We would fly, like a typical crew member like me, we would fly a morning flight on this day. It would be 6:30 takeoff. We'd land at 2:30, but not until the other folks had taken off and relieved us. So the next day, we would fly that second flight of the day, right? And then the third day, we would fly that third flight of the day, which went from 10:30 at night till 6:30 in the morning, something like that. So, 6 to 8 hour flights, depending on the profile. But we did that day in, day out, time and time again, day after day after day after day, only interrupted by sitting on ground alert somewhere waiting for the Russians to strike, right? So, but to go from that to not flying every day was like, what just happened? And all that came about because of the fall of the wall, the end of the Cold War, right? All of that changed our posture because that arms race we had been through, the Russians clearly lost. And then it just, set of circumstances, things changed. They decided that continuous airborne alert was no longer necessary after the Russian collapse. So we continued to fly the missions and practice like we all do in the military, right? But we didn't have a continuous, we might have a mission a day or 2 missions a day or it would be dictated by some other variables. So we stopped the continuous airborne alert. And then eventually, because of the age of our aircraft, remember I said when the mission started, the planes were relatively new to the inventory, right? Late 50s, early 60s. Well, now we're up to 1990. Those things are flying every single day, right? So you can imagine the hours that have been accumulated on the airframes. And it was just, they were just tired and sad, and they decided that, okay, we're gonna change platforms for this mission. And then I've got some pictures. We actually transferred the mission from the EC-135 airframe, not just to another airframe, but to another branch of the service. We handed the mission, at least the flight operation component of the mission, over to the Navy to fly on their E-6 Mercury, which I have a couple pictures of, with a multi-service flight crew and battle staff. And that happened in '98. And then in this window, 92, 3, 4 to 8, all the planes that we loved. You guys that are pilots or aircrew members, every airplane has a personality or develops one to you if you fly it regularly, right? The same thing with us. You look at the tail number, you know you're going to have a problem with the switchboard. You look at the tail number, you know you're going to, oh, the pilot's going to have an interphone problem. That's just 585. That's going to happen, right? So, you know, and they felt like a living soul, right? So now we're sending them to the boneyard. Wow. That does a couple things. It crushes your spirit, right? Because those were living beings. And then it's like, am I really old enough that planes I flew on are in the boneyard now? As a kid, who else looked at books and stuff and magazines about the boneyard down at Davis-Monthan? I did. I finally was able to get out there about 8 years ago. And it was the first time I was able to visit the boneyard, and I was able to see planes that I actually had flown on.
Wow.
And it was, my eyeballs were leaking a little bit, and the guy next to me on the bus was like, "What's wrong with you?" Anyway, I'm kind of a sensitive soul. But anyway, so eventually the planes began to, make their way to their final resting place, and unfortunately, I've made several trips back there since. Unfortunately, everyone that was there of the inventory, there's probably, between all those bases I mentioned, maybe 30 in the inventory, and eventually, with a few exceptions that are still intact as gate guards you see at certain bases you might see, all of them were chopped up. Yeah, that was probably worse than seeing them lay there, helpless in the graveyard, to go there and know that they had been through the shredder. Except for one, tail number 049, which I have some pictures of, and I'm going to tell a little bit of story about that as we go. Okay, yes sir?
How many EC-135s would be in the air at one time?
Okay.
You had to have the 24-hour, always one up.
Yep.
But how many would be up? Are you going to make?
Oh, anything I say here is we held a TSSCI clearance, of course, because we could launch nuclear missiles. But anything I tell you today, none of it is confidential. So there would always be at least one in the air, right? Now, it's likely that there were others in the air for particular things, because we would always, not only were we flying that operational looking glass mission every single day, we were practicing the ancillary missions, right? The being able to relay a signal through another aircraft to a missile field near Minot, or all of those kind of things. We call them auxiliary aircraft, and we would practice the handoff of the control of the nuclear forces from one aircraft to the other, right? So there was always something going on, but from an operational mission perspective, you could guarantee there was always one looking glass airborne, but likely others doing certain things for proficiency or exercises and stuff like that.
An inventory of 30.
About 30-ish, maybe 40 in that range. This is what the platform looked like. You can see everything was silver back then, right? In the early 60s, they hadn't got to painting things the way they do today. But and you see
Big antenna, the big rotating antennas.
not on this plane. That would be the AWACS that had the rotating antenna, sort of a sister mission, but we did not have that. So early pictures of the inside of a typically outfitted command post aircraft. Coincidentally, in the lower right there he's turning one of the keys to launch a nuclear missile, right? And you could practice that without actually doing it, by the way. And we practiced a lot. You practice because you have a sequence of things to run through, right? Checks and balances and this and that, right? So you always practice it. Now I'm getting ahead of myself. I've got some pictures on that.
So how much communication does a center go through before something actually gets executed?
All right, I'm not sure I heard that 100%.
How much communication actually happens before a launch?
Oh gosh, a lot, yeah. It's and on purpose, right? You want it to be difficult to launch a nuclear missile, right? So you can imagine the checks and balances that have to occur. This has to be just right. This has to be just right. Actually, one of my roles in that chain of things that have to be just right is to make sure the radio signal that's going from the aircraft to the missile silo or to the crew, my little piece of the chain there, one of my little pieces of the chain, was to make sure that that radio signal stayed in a certain range of specifications from a noise level, right? I had an array of equipment I could use to monitor and measure that, right? So a lot of checks and balances involved, technology-wise and procedural-wise, for sure. Yes, ma'am.
Was the other person with the key beside that one or in another part of the plane? Were they
In the same compartment, but far enough away that one person couldn't turn both. Yeah, and it kind of varied by platform because we had a couple of different platforms that could perform that mission, and the location was slightly different, but you can guarantee that not one person, well, being curious young 20-somethings, one person can turn two keys, we've proven that, but we don't tell everybody that. And it takes a little bit of finagling to do it, but don't tell the Russians that. All right. So here's a little bit about what the typical orbit would look like for this network of communications aircraft. And this is in the 70s. This image comes from the 70s, but this was still applicable in the 80s and 90s when I was flying the mission. And you can see the orbits generally allow for a relay of information to occur from the East Coast, right, DC area, all the way into the interior to SAC in Omaha. And you can see some of the other orbits. You can see there's no surprise that those are in our northern tier missile fields. So that's a typical, sort of peacetime, like you ask about, at any given time, we might be practicing all of these things, right? The one plane has the looking glass mission. Here's some shots of the jet through time. I flew on all these guys here. You can see I like these because they allow me to kind of show you the array of antennas that are on the platform. Yes, sir.
Do I see the KC refueling boom on those airplanes?
You do. I'm going to talk more about that, I think, on the next slide, actually. It's another interesting feature that gave us this increased capability. But if you look at the antennas on top, let me just describe to you, and some of you probably know, there's satellite antennas. Believe it or not, even in the early 90s when I was flying, the hump you see on this particular airframe has a super high frequency AFSATCOM antenna. The underside and the top are riddled with UHF and VHF antennas. Some of you Air Force guys, stubby dipole antennas that we use for UHF. So a lot of antennas on the plane. The big saddleback antenna, the black one there, that's for receive on that low frequency where we communicate with the submarines. That was one of the antennas for that system.
Is that a relay antenna?
Well, we could operate in that mode, but instead of relaying, we took the role of actually sending the primary signal to the recipient. So just to highlight a bunch of the different antenna types there that you see, these 1, 2, 3 are all EC-135C models that we would have flown the looking glass mission on. And the one in the lower right is one that I flew out of RAF Mildenhall, which was an H model, slightly different capability. We couldn't launch nukes from that one. A little bit of a different battle staff configuration. On the mission I flew in Europe, on the lower right, we could spin up a number of different mission profiles to include a multi-service battle staff component, planners and whatnot, or a multinational. So we could fly to SHAPE headquarters in Belgium, pick up a back-end crew that was a multinational, and go fly the mission against that profile. So we had a lot of flexibility that we could execute there. But a lot of comm in this plane, a lot of comm. There's a battle staff in there that's directing the war, right, including a general officer. But they need communications to stay in contact with the people they're trying to direct or receive information from. So the antennas correspond generally to a variety of communication systems, right? Whether it's SATCOM or traditional radio, HF radio for over the horizon sort of stuff. So a pretty good suite of communications. Yes, sir.
Did we only have nuclear missile silos in the United States, or did we have any abroad?
The intercontinental ballistic missiles were only in the U.S. on U.S. soil. Now we did have nukes elsewhere. Turkey's one for sure. Yep.
That was part of the missiles of October.
But those aren't satellite
Yep.
missiles, those are
Right, they're typically like truck launched. Yeah, truck mounted. So pointed. Yes, ma'am.
I have a friend whose daughter was in the first Bush administration, so to speak. Very pretty girl, very smart. And she found herself being chosen with a bunch of single men. She's still single. And they were there was another girl too. They were the protected group to repopulate.
Oh my. All right. I never got that duty. How do you put that on your dream sheet, I guess, right?
She was not happy.
With the pairings that they had in mind. Okay, great story. That's a whole presentation on its own there. Somebody pointed out the refueling boom.
Yeah.
And since this platform was originated on the KC-135 platform, which was built as a area refueling tanker, that was part of the attraction to use this platform, because not every C-135 was a tanker. So the K denotes tanker, KC-135, but every EC-135 that became a command post had been a KC-135, so tanker. So part of our crew complement, in addition to a pilot, co-pilot, and a navigator, we always had a boom operator on board, and that boom operator stayed busy, trust me, because we flew 8-10-hour missions, so we always refueled in the air. So we were an EC, so we could pass gas, receive gas and pass gas. And if you're a boom operator in the boom operator world, they say they have the best job in the Air Force, because they just get to lay on their belly and pass gas all day. So, but nowadays the newer tankers. Oh, by the way, these tankers, the tanker platforms are still flying. This is still our primary tanker platform. It'll outlive the KC-10s that we've used for the last 30 years. Of course, the tankers that are still flying that are KC-135s have newer engines now, which has extended their life. But so yeah, we could receive and give fuel there with the refueling boom, and it's a thrill as a young 20-something to be down here in this boom pod when you're landing and taking off out of the Azores or out of Iceland or wherever you happen to be. Not supposed to be down there, but that's okay. We were.
Y'all could suck gas out of another airplane with the boom?
Not that, no, it wouldn't come that way. We had a receptacle, see right here, on the top, so they could give us gas, and then we could give someone else gas.
So you had fuel on board to refuel somebody else if necessary?
If the mission profile called for it, yeah. And the guys, our front end crew, that's a task that you have to practice a lot, whether you're the one giving or receiving, because again, there's procedures and stuff, especially if you're the receiver. You got to get, you got to get yourself just right, and then the boom operator does a little bit of help by extending the boom down into the receptacle there. But they did it a lot. We did it a lot. We did it on operational missions. We would always refuel.
How long were you hooked up typically?
Well, again, it depends on how much fuel that we asked for, right? But usually, what would happen in a typical mission? What would happen is a plane might come up and stay connected for less than 5 minutes to get their fuel offload. But then they'd back off and come back and practice again, right? Because while you have the opportunity, both pilots wanted to practice, right? Just like touch and goes, right? So we would always stay in an aerial refueling track for 30 minutes to an hour, depending on that kind of circumstance. So here's the part of that other unique capability where we could communicate with the submarines that were submerged, is through that LF-VLF system. Remember I said that the lower the frequency, the longer the wavelength? Well, to get a long wavelength, you have to have a long antenna. How do we do that on an airplane? Well, this is how we do it. In fact, here's another parallel to a B-17, which has a similar arrangement. We could extend an antenna out the belly of the aircraft. And the length of that antenna would dictate the wavelength, which dictated the frequency by which you were going to communicate with someone. And another part of my little piece of the puzzle was to make sure that the transmitter was operating efficiently and effectively and was putting out the right amount of power without reflecting too much and all that stuff. A little bit of a work, it was sort of a manual process to make that occur in those days. But just to give you kind of an idea of the scale, this antenna, you can see the orange is not the antenna. Anybody know what the orange is? The orange cone?
It's a drogue.
It's a drogue, right. It just keeps the antenna taut. So the properties of that drogue with the airflow allow it to put the tension on the antenna to keep it, from flapping around, right? And that drogue weighs 90 pounds. It's held into the coffin there with some fingers, right? But anyway, so we get the frequency. Okay, we got to talk to so and so on this frequency. Okay, we would do the calculation. If we need to talk on this frequency, that means we got to have this wavelength, which means we got to let the wire out this much. Well,
verbal communication?
Part of it's verbal, part might come in, we might get instructions to come in over satellite links, we might get instructions, the radio operators in the compartment might get instructions from the comm officer, and we don't really care where he got them from somewhere in the back, and then we just execute on it. So it just all depended on the mission profile and who we needed to talk to, where we were located. Because think about it, what I'm going to tell you here is going to drive the next part of the conversation on location. And that's the fact that in order to get to those lower frequency ranges that penetrate the ocean, right, you have to have a long antenna. How long? We could let this antenna out of the belly of the aircraft 5 miles. So we're flying over the North Atlantic or the North Sea or the Gulf of Mexico, or why am I saying flying over bodies of water? Because I've got 5 miles of wire antenna hanging behind me, right? So you can't do it under normal circumstances over land, certainly populated areas. So we would always fly these missions and do this practice over a body of water, right?
Was weather a factor?
Weather's a factor. In fact, weather's a factor always with flying, but it's certainly a factor when you're going to let something out the back of your airplane. Now I'll tell you, I've been on a number of missions where that antenna departed the aircraft and is in the North Sea right now, or in the North Atlantic or the Gulf. I've been on a lot of them, and there's a lot of reasons why that happens. Just mechanical failure. We have to tell the pilot, so the pilot has to know that the drogue is out, because it's going to change how he operates the aircraft, right? He can't put too much tension on this wire that's hanging behind you, right? Well, sometimes they forget. And so sometimes they just snap off. Sometimes they won't come back in. a mechanical failure won't allow you to retrieve it, and you're like, all right, what do we do now? We have a couple of different ways to remedy that, and it involves cutting it, right? So we could cut it at the console, or the pilot could cut it actually in the cockpit.
So no hand cranks.
No hand cranks. No hand crank to pull that thing in. Oh God, I'd hate that. Yes, sir.
Can a ham operator either intercept or hear?
Not this frequency spectrum, but certainly the HF, the high frequency stuff, yeah. In fact, there's a lot of commonality between some of the military frequencies and some of the civilian bands. In fact, we used to have a lot of fun flying into Omaha and keying up certain radio to open garage doors on final approach, right? So there's a lot of things you can do that you probably shouldn't do. But when you're 20-something, remember, I keep coming back to that. I was young at one time.
And they charge them nuclear weapons.
Yeah, exactly. So that other unique characteristic that we had was that airborne launch control system. And here's just a couple of pictures to bring that to life. Here's the launch control panel, one of the two stations with the key. And then here's an example of actually launching an ICBM out of, typically we would launch them out of Vandenberg Air Force Base. And whenever we would, of course we never did one of those for real, right? Or the Russians would be pissed. But we would practice it a lot. We would practice actually launching the nuclear missiles out of Vandenberg so that we could know that the process, the procedure, the technology, everything worked, right? And remember before I said you can't prevent the Russians from launching, right? Well, it turns out our ability to survive and respond turned out to be the greatest deterrence.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And that's all part of the story of why this is the classic Cold War mission.
Did you know what their targets would be, their initial targets in the United States were? I mean, I'm assuming you knew that it's going to be like New York City.
Well, let's put it this way. Every time we took off, we knew that if it hit the fan, that our families were vaporized when we came back. I mean, there was nowhere to come back to, right? So it was that realization that you knew that, you kind of, you're a pilot, so you kind of arrive at a place where I'll do everything I can do, and and the rest is up to God, and it's beyond me. But this what's cool about this bottom left picture is we would practice those launches, and had a really cool nickname called a glory trip. How about that for practicing launching a nuke at Russia, right? A glory trip. So it was kind of cool to be involved in one of those because you really then got to practice or test that capability for real, right? And then the cool thing about it is you would get close enough to Vandenberg. You only had to be within radio distance to launch it, right? But you wanted to get there and you wanted to see that thing come out of the silo. So we would orbit in a pattern that we could have the best observation of the missile leaving Vandenberg. So it was really a cool thing to be on a glory trip. And we would do these maybe once or twice a year where we would exercise that capability. And oftentimes they would take a live missile that had been in the missile field under Wyoming or Kansas or whatever. They would ship it to Vandenberg and launch it.
With a warhead? No.
Not with warhead, no. But you remind me of an interesting story about the warhead. So, anybody know what a MIRV is?
Yeah, multiple entry.
Yeah, it's the multiple entry re-entry vehicle. So most of our missiles had multiple nuclear warheads on the tip. So when the missile got over a certain altitude, certain target, then cap would open, and then those individual warheads would go to their target, right? So, and that's true with the Minuteman and
As 10, I understand, if I remember.
as many as 10, I think, depending on the model, yeah. But an interesting thing, there was another payload that these missiles could deliver, and we quit doing it at about maybe 91 or so. But we had a package that was positioned, a number of them, in certain missile silos across the central U.S. that didn't have a nuclear warhead on it, but it had a communications repeater on it. So basically we would launch a radio station into orbit that we could then talk through, right? It would give us another sort of pre-satellite type of long-range survivable communications path. So we had, these ICBMs tipped with these radio packages that could perform that relay operation for us. Kind of a cool thing a lot of people don't know.
Would we tell the Russians that we're getting ready to launch a test missile? And
Yeah.
we would tell them that ahead of time.
Yeah, and hope they did the same for us, which they did. So that's, you can see it, Minuteman over there.
You didn't put a stork on the end of any of those missiles, did you?
No,
Little babies?
no pizza delivery or anything, although it's 30 minutes or less. That's for sure.
Or else.
So, a couple of oopses. I wasn't involved in all these, but these are planes I flew, and I was there when all this happened. But fortunately, through all of that flying, 30 years worth of continuous airborne alert, 3 missions a day, and then plus the ancillary missions in those other programs. During my window, these were the only 3 that I have familiarity with. The top one happened at Pope Air Force Base, of all places. Landing gear collapsed. No big deal. Everybody got out okay. The one on the bottom left, I know you can't see that very well. It's the only picture I have of it, but that was at Langley Air Force Base, and tail number 007 caught fire. There was caught fire in the comm compartment or something, and it just burnt to the ground. And then the one that I'm most familiar with.
Caught fire on the ground.
On the ground,
okay.
Yeah, on the ground. It wasn't I guess that changes the mishap category, but the one on the lower right, the one I'm most familiar with, I had just got off of this plane a couple days before. We had taken this particular plane, 584, to England to fly an exercise over there for 2 weeks, and we did our thing in the Mediterranean and all through Europe, doing testing and exercise and all the normal stuff we do. We came back home to Offutt. Plane gets its normal maintenance and everything. Loaded up another Air Force crew. They flew it out to North Carolina. We had started, this is Gulf War era time now. We started doing some missions. We started to, remember we came off of continuous airborne alert and we stopped doing that mission, but a lot of other agencies began to notice what we were capable of, and all of a sudden we had the capability to do some of those other profiles. So we started loading up a bunch of grunts in the back, Army battlefield managers, and we would fly these tactical command post missions, and we would do that with special ops guys out of Fort Bragg Pope Air Force Base there. And unfortunately, these guys came in along on a wet runway, and the rest is history there. You can see the back broke and all the gear sheared and everything. But the good news is, and we're sitting on a big old fuel tank, right? Remember, we're a tanker. The good news is no fire, and everybody got out. Everybody got out okay.
Well, that was scary.
Okay, so now what did I do? I talked a little bit about a couple of things, but like Brent said, I was depending on the base we were at and the mission, they would call us a number of different things. Communication systems engineer, in-flight maintenance technician, airborne radio maintenance, and we went by a lot of things. And so my job, and 2 of us on the typical mission, 2 of us, our job was to keep all this array of communications I've been talking about operating. So there are certain systems that we had operational control over, and then the rest of the systems, it was up to us to fix what the other guys broke and to keep the mission going, right? So you can see there's a picture of a young guy there laying in the floor in the rack, trying to troubleshoot an RT or something, right? So this is typically what I would be doing on a mission. That's me standing in the upper left there at one of those stations where I said I can monitor all kind of performance stuff. So I would be doing that with my colleague there. It's my buddy Todd. He passed about 3 years ago from throat cancer. Unfortunately, a lot of us, myself excluded, but a lot of us have developed similar cancers over the years. Unfortunately, it took Todd, but I don't know. Environmental radio frequency. I mean, think about this is a tin can at 30,000 feet being bombarded by all of that RF. I don't know. I do have 5 kids though, so it didn't it didn't have that sort of impact. Now they're all ugly, but
They all have 2 legs and 2 arms.
two legs and 2 arms, right?
Guy, did y'all have thyroid cancers in that group?
Yes.
My son's a commercial pilot with 777s in Palm Concord 13 years, and he had to have half his thyroid removed.
Yeah.
Because he had enlargement. He was just a young man. But because he said he sat in the right seat and the sunlight hit him in the neck every day, 35,000 feet for 13 hours.
Yeah, there's some of the guys are trying to make the correlation and stuff, but I don't know how different we are from any other demographic.
It's not uncommon that people that operate at that altitude, particularly if they get direct sunlight through a window, have a problem.
So here, I'm monitoring here. I'm monitoring down there. Actually, having a cup of coffee. Everything must have been running smoothly. I was having a cup of coffee there, and here some stuff's broke. So I'm working on it here in the other shots. Now I'll tell you, when you fly an 8-hour mission and everything's operating smoothly, you might have a lot of time to take a nap or read a book, and I'll say we had plenty of that, and especially on the Looking Glass mission where you're just poking holes in the sky for 8 hours and everything's operating, don't touch it, right? So you have a lot of time to kind of read, and a lot of guys went to college, and they would spend a lot of the mission studying, but you had to be ready to spring into action, at any given time and fix anything that was breaking or execute on some new exercise or whatever. So that was sort of my role there. Like I mentioned, there were 2 of me on the crew complement, and we lived in this compartment right here. We called the comm compartment with the communications systems operators. So there were professionals that would operate the satellite system, the digital data systems, the radio systems, and all of that. And we have an ongoing love-hate with them because everything they broke that meant work for us, we had to fix, right? But I tell you, I'm still in touch with them after 30, 40 years, and in fact, we're getting ready to have a big reunion in Branson here coming up pretty soon, and that rivalry still exists today. So I mentioned, so we're coming to the end of the story here, at least my part of the story. The last Looking Glass mission that was flown on an EC-135 occurred there in 1998. So I had already gotten out by then, but this was the last flight. A lot of my colleagues that I flew with were part of the crew. There's S2, Steve Shirley, Hatbrock, Minuti, a number of others there that we all grew up together, Robin, and they got the honor of flying on the last operational Looking Glass mission on the EC-135. So what happened next? The mission lives on, actually. Like I mentioned, we turned it over to the Navy, right? So these airframes that the Navy was flying had much fewer hours than ours, right? Than ours had. So the Pentagon said, let's just take the capability you guys had off those old airframes. We'll move it over to these newer airframes, newer engines.
Navy airplanes?
Yes, sir. The only problem for the Air Force guys is they happen to belong to the Navy pukes. So, we were like, oh man, we're giving this wonderful mission we were a part of over to the Swabbies, But anyway, it was a smooth transition, I think, for the most part.
I see a tail hook on either one of them.
So, yes, so that's the capability that this aircraft did not provide, was air refueling, at least they could receive, which was probably the most important thing, but they couldn't deliver. Or can't deliver. As you can see, some similarities in like the hump on top, right, which we had, the SHF antenna. But so today, the Looking Glass mission still flies, still capable of communicating with the submerged nuclear submarine fleet, and able to launch our Minuteman missiles. So the capability still exists but on this airframe. So the crew complement here is a Navy flight crew, but everybody aft is Air Force, and with some multi-service thrown in there for good measure. And when the Strategic Air Command dissolved, and I was there at Offutt when the change occurred, it became Stratcom. That was 90. Was it 90 or 91? So many things happened right in that window my last few years. The demise of the Soviet Union, the Gulf War. It was just an amazing period there. But they still fly the mission today. These jets are based at Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma, but they do pull alert and fly missions out of Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, where the original Looking Glass was based. Although the runway's being redone right now because it got flooded a couple years ago, and they're operating out of Lincoln, Nebraska at the moment. And this was the sad part. I don't know how many they have. They fly a Navy mission that you may have heard of called TACAMO. Well, the Navy TACAMO, Take Charge and Move Out, is what that stands for in Navy parlance. But they've always had this capability to talk to the submarines like us, right? So they have that long wire antenna concept as well, as does this guy. The difference is we had one wire and we could transmit 20,000 watts on that antenna. This plane can transmit 100,000 watts on that same frequency range. And in order to do that, there's some other technical things you have to do, and it dictates two antennas. Actually, an antenna can have multiple legs. It's actually one antenna, but it has two wires that come out. One of them is the ground plane for that signal. So that's what the Navy has always done with their. They used to do it on a C-130 platform, and then they moved to this platform. So that's part of the reason it made this platform a logical path for the Looking Glass mission to take. And here's some shots of the boneyard that I was talking about. So you can imagine rolling up on there. These things felt like living beings to you, and they're all in various states of disarray. So I've been able to go to the boneyard 3 times. Twice I was able to see different planes I flew on. The third time, none. They had all been shredded.
You don't have one in Wright Pat?
They do not have one at Wright Pat, which is a very good question. If any aircraft is going to be in Wright Pat, you would think it would be the Looking Glass, right? The Cold War staple. But there is not one. But more about that in a minute.
My ex-husband flew the EC-121, which is like, I think, the stagecoach version of this. And that little hump there is so cute. His airplane had a big monster, hunchback thing on top and another pregnant thing. It was an awful looking thing in the air.
Some say that's the most beautiful airplane to ever exist.
The constellation was when it was in.
But it had some warts and stuff on it, didn't it? Yeah.
But their missions were like 15, 16 hours out over the Pacific.
Yeah.
But what did they do? I mean, to him it was super top secret.
Yeah.
Graduated last in his class, what do I know? They had a Cuban thing. A bunch of the guys from Sacramento were sent over to Florida to direct the U-2 airplanes over Cuba, which terrified me because my family was in Cuba.
Oh my.
And, but did that have anything to do with this?
No, not really, except the fact that the idea was there, command control. We did use some Connies in Vietnam for command and control missions. They were kind of a blend between platforms. They had an AWACS-like capability with those radomes, plus they could do some command post and radio relay type stuff.
And it hadn't radio last yet. They're close to it, but...
Yeah. So, I said all of them got chopped up in the boneyard except for one, and it's tail number 049. You can see it here. There are no wings on it. It's set. This was the aircraft that flew that last Looking Glass mission, the one that showed the Navy Admiral in the middle. This was the plane that flew the last mission, and there's a very nice museum in Omaha called the Strategic Air. It used to be just called the SAC Museum for years, but it's called the Strategic Air Command and Aerospace Museum. It's between Omaha and Lincoln. If you ever drive an I-80 up there, it's a must stop. Well, they started restoring this aircraft about 8 or 10 years ago. It sat outside in the elements at the museum for 17 years. So you can imagine when they went to restore it, there was your expected number of rodents and birds' nests and stuff. But over the years, and my job, for a number of years there, my job would carry me to Omaha for work. So I would always get to go check on the progress of the old girl. And we would orchestrate, gatherings and formal reunions around the progress of the aircraft. And so over the years, they completely gutted it. You can see the cockpit looking forward there as an example of how to what extent they went to do the restoration. And there's that's from standing just behind the cockpit looking aft. So this is normally full of communications equipment and consoles and stuff. So they took all of this stuff out over the years, and there's me on one of our periodic gatherings where we got to actually convince the staff to let us go on board, and got some snapshots 20 years after. Kind of fun, but you can see them getting ready now for paint. And then here is the aircraft fully restored last October. They had the grand opening of the restoration. We went up there and had a big celebration, of course, and got to walk onto the airplane. And I got to admit to you, it looks better than it ever did when we were flying on it. But by the time I started flying on it, they were already 20 years in the fleet, right? And you can imagine, how many peanut butter sandwiches were behind the console, and how, this and that and the other. So walking on board, it was familiar and unfamiliar, because you're back in your old office, but...
Were the consoles restored?
They were. Everything was restored. Everything was restored. Wow. And it's just absolutely beautiful if you ever get up there. It's now, it was in the restoration hangar, right, for years, but now it's actually in the museum as an official exhibit. And indoors, protected, and they do regular events where they allow the public to actually go on and tour and walk through, and they'll have old guys like me that flew on it talk, inside talking about it, shepherding them through and stuff like that. So I'm not sure when I'm going to get to go back up again, but at least I've seen it. I flew on it, I saw it when it was torn apart, and now I've seen it after it's been restored. So, some of you know this story from last time I was here. So fast forward 30-some years, and I'm at the museum down at the Mighty 8th Museum in Savannah, and we're getting ready to do one of those operations, right, where we crank up the amateur radio system on the B-17 and celebrate something. It happened to be, I think this was for D-Day. So it was like in July or something, and the museum was celebrating that. Does anybody recognize the general there?
Of course. Yeah, Buck Schuler.
Buck Schuler, a founding member of the museum, I believe, if I'm right.
Commander of the 8th Air Force.
Commander of the 8th Air Force.
Still on our board.
Still on the board. Well, he and I knew of him, and I knew he was involved in the project down there and with the museum, but he and I had never talked. And we had the opportunity to just sit there like two guys, two Air Force vets talking about our time in the service. And it didn't take us long to realize, wait a minute, Schuler, And then, of course, he didn't know me. I was a staff sergeant. He was a general, right? So, although I'll tell you, the generals were awesome on the plane. I mean, I've had, you saw me laying in the floor there, reaching into a cabinet. I would have a general right there helping me, handing me parts and stuff. That's how, these crews turned out to be, and especially guys like General Schuler. Anyway, so we were talking at the museum and very quickly realized, wait a minute, we were both on the glass in the same years at the same time. We actually flew together on the Looking Glass, and here we are reigniting that at the B-17 City of Savannah just a couple of years ago. So I got
On the same airplane at the same time?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. How about that? And so I got a picture with him and his wife, and I forget the other, maybe Brent knows the other former Air Force officer there. I can't remember.
I don't know here. I probably do know him.
Anyway, so that's just a kind of an interesting side story and another little connection as to why this is an appropriate subject maybe for, it's kind of a stretch, but for the 8th Air Force. Now, like the accidents, along the way you lose comrades and stuff, and for me, during my time of service, there were a couple of examples of that. Now, these are men that weren't killed operating on this mission that I flew with them on, but they were killed in other incidents along the way during their service. The first is Master Sergeant Mike Heiser. Mike and I flew together on the SYNC platform out of RAF Mildenhall, and he went on to fly other platforms as a radio operator on special air missions, and he happened to be in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and was one of the 19 airmen killed in the Khobar Tower bombing in 1996. And I finally got to visit him at Arlington a few years back, where he's buried in Section 60 there. And then Michael Anderson, Lieutenant Colonel, United States Air Force, was one of our pilots on the Looking Glass in the early 90s, and I had the opportunity to serve with him and fly with him. And unfortunately, he was killed on the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster. And was it 2002, maybe? 2003. So, two fellow Looking Glass crew members there that have left us. Now, Brent knows a little bit about my story, and he asked me to tack this on to the end. I'm very proud of my service and my family service, and I'm about to wrap it up, though. If they're about to kick me out, I'm getting close to the end here. But like Brent said, my kids, 4 of my 5 kids have served, and you can see pictures of my dad and my father-in-law and my wife there in the middle. That's my wife, Lori. When I met her in the parking lot of the barracks, she smelled like diesel fuel and was covered in grease, and it was love at first sight. And we've been married since 1984. So, there was some chemistry there. Maybe it was jet fuel and diesel, I don't know. But that's Lori. She was an aerospace ground equipment maintenance person, age mechanic. She took care of all the compressors and air conditioners and power carts and stuff like that. She'll tell you she wasn't a very good one, but she was one.
FMS.
FMS, field maintenance, yep.
Not bad for a girl.
Not bad at all. Not bad at all. And then you can see a young guy there, my daughter Hannah, who was in the Georgia Guard. My youngest son in the lower middle there was in Air Force Special Operation Command. He was a gunner on the AC-130 gunships, the big howitzers out the side. Yeah, so he operated that, and he spent about 4 years. He's actually in pilot training right now, private pilot training at the moment. And then Brent mentioned my dad, who's actually in the Georgia Military Veterans Hall of Fame. My dad is Guy McDonald Sr. Was awarded a Silver Star and a Purple Heart in Vietnam, and he got into the hall in the Valor category. When I was growing up on Marine Corps bases, I thought everybody's dad was a badass Marine. I didn't know any better. But as I got older and stuff, I really started to admire the things that my dad did, and it especially hit home to me when I was probably a teenager and I read his Silver Star citation. I'm like, wow, it's crazy. But anyway, I was so proud of my dad. There he is at the Capitol getting his award. There he is as a 110-pound Marine there. In the lower section there. One picture that's missing on there is my young lady daughter, my youngest. She's an FBI Academy graduate. She did her master's degree at the Bush School of Government at Texas A&M after graduating from Georgia Southern. Got accepted to the FBI Academy and completed the academy a couple years ago.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And this is the part of the story Brent knows a little bit about the story. I haven't had the opportunity to tell it a lot in a group like this, but I do like to share this with people because it's such an important thing for us to always be remembering. Like Brent said, and Brent took one of my favorite quotes about, it's so favorite that I can't remember it at this moment. Used to saying their names, yeah. So, they say a person dies twice, once when they take their last breath, and again, if their name is no longer spoken. And we had the unfortunate tragedy of losing our son, who was an Iraqi combat vet, and he wasn't killed in Iraq. But the circumstances of his death, we still, he was certainly a casualty of war. In the few years after he got back and separated from the Army, he was one of too many that got entangled and didn't have a direction, didn't have a guidance, didn't have the help from the VA, I'm sorry to say. And I know that's sporadic. I'm not casting shadow on all of that organization, but in his particular case, it turned out to be not of any value. But anyway, we lost him in 2016, and after this normal time of grieving, you get to this point where you're like, man, is my son, is he going to be remembered? Am I the only one that's ever going to remember him? And so my wife and I we decided we were on this mission to make sure that he wasn't forgotten, and part of that is saying his name, speaking his name, and that's the logo you see there is a logo I came up with that kind of represents the service organization of ours. He was an accomplished guitar player. So speaking of Zane became the name of the org, and so I get on the air every Sunday night and just talk about Zane and talk about his service and make sure that he's not forgotten, and not just him, but men and women like him. There's, you guys know the number, 22, some estimated 22 veterans a day commit suicide, and then there's another group of them that maybe they didn't intentionally commit suicide, but they succumb to some addiction, whether it's drugs or alcohol or whatever. That's probably a whole nother 22 a day if you look at it that way. So anyway, I'm not saying we're making this monumental impact with this small group of individuals, and me, talking about my son and Veterans Matters, but if it helps raise awareness and if it helps keep someone else from losing their son in similar circumstances, it's something that I want to do. Until I'm gone and can't say his name anymore, then we'll continue to do that. He's buried at Georgia National Cemetery right up here in Canton, and we live about 20 miles away. So I'm a regular visitor to the cemetery, and I describe it like this, and I don't claim to be the only one that's ever lost a son or a daughter, and maybe some of you have, and so you know the feeling of it. And I never want to sound preachy, right? Because the old thing about everybody has problems. If everybody put their problem in a hat and you pulled one out, you'd want your problem back, right? And so that's kind of the outlook that I have. But anyway, when I go there, the way I describe it to people, even after 6 years, it's my favorite place to go and it's my least favorite place to go. How do you reconcile that, right? It's a very strange thing, but it's true. It's the way I feel when I visit there. I would rather be somewhere else, and I'd rather not be somewhere else. It's the only way I can describe that feeling. But that's Zane, Specialist Zane McDonald. He was in the 3rd ID, actually, based in Hinesville, down there at Fort Stewart, as part of the 3rd Infantry Division. That's it. That's it. How about that? Well, thanks for having me back again, Brent. I'd love to answer any questions if there's any questions.